Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from, and what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between, I want to see how far this story can reach. Now lean closer. Here's where it all begins. The beer mug shattered against the wall inches from 17-year-old Lucien Dubois' head, sending foam and glass cascading down his trembling shoulders as the three Crane brothers circled him like wolves around wounded prey. The Red Moon Saloon had fallen silent, except for their cruel laughter, echoing off weathered wooden walls, every patron suddenly finding their drinks more interesting than the torture unfolding in front of their eyes. "Look at this baby-faced kid," sneered Jake Crane, the eldest brother whose scarred knuckles spoke of countless fights won through brutality rather than skill. "Thinks he can drink with real men when he should be home sucking his mama's milk." Lucien stood frozen against the bar, his thin frame dwarfed by the three giants who'd singled him out for sport the moment he'd walked through the saloon doors. At 17, he looked even younger. Smooth cheeks that had never known a razor, wide brown eyes that still held innocence despite the hardships that had brought him to this godforsaken mining town in the Colorado Territory. His worn clothes and nervous manner marked him as easy prey for men who found entertainment in breaking spirits that were already bent by loss and desperation. "Please," Lucien whispered, his voice barely audible above the brothers' taunts. "I just wanted one drink before I head back to camp. I'm not looking for trouble." His words only made the Crane brothers laugh harder, because they knew fear when they smelled it, and this kid reeked of the kind of terror that made bullying feel like sport. They'd been drinking since noon, celebrating another successful claim jump that had netted them gold while leaving a family homeless in the wilderness, and they were in the mood for entertainment that involved making someone else suffer. But in the shadowy corner booth where no one dared to look, a figure in black had been watching the confrontation with eyes that missed nothing and a stillness that suggested violence, coiled like a rattlesnake in summer heat. Mathieu Beaumont sat motionless behind a whiskey glass that hadn't been touched in an hour, his weathered face hidden beneath a hat brim that had seen too many miles and too much blood. Most folks in Perdition Gulch knew better than to even glance in his direction, because legends walked carefully in a world where reputation could kill faster than bullets. When Bear Crane, the middle brother whose massive fists had crippled men for lesser offenses, drew back his arm to deliver a blow that would leave the boy broken and bloody on the saloon floor, something shifted in the darkness where Mathieu Beaumont had been sitting so quietly that people forgot he was there. The scrape of his chair against wooden planks cut through the tension like a blade, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that made hardened criminals step aside and ordinary bullies reconsider their life choices. "That's enough," he said, rising to his full height with predatory grace that transformed the saloon's atmosphere from cruel entertainment to something far more dangerous. "Walk away now, or learn why they call me the Devil's Shadow." Mathieu Beaumont's reputation had traveled faster than wildfire across 3 territories, whispered in saloons and mining camps by men who'd witnessed his deadly skills and lived to spread warnings about the gunfighter whose speed bordered on supernatural and whose sense of justice was as unforgiving as winter in the high country. He was a legend wrapped in black leather and silence, someone whose real name was known, but whose true story remained hidden behind years of calculated violence that had made him the most feared and respected gun in the American West. The stories told about Mathieu varied depending on who was doing the telling, but they all agreed on certain facts that had been confirmed by too many witnesses to be dismissed as frontier exaggeration. He'd killed 43 men in fair fights, and twice that number in situations where fairness had been abandoned for survival, his draw so fast that most opponents died wondering when he'd cleared leather. More importantly, he'd never been known to harm an innocent person, which made him something rarer than a quick gun. He was death with a conscience. What made Mathieu truly dangerous wasn't just his ability to kill, but his intelligence in choosing when killing was necessary and when other forms of justice might serve better. He'd been a Texas Ranger, a federal marshal, a cavalry scout, and a vigilante, adapting his methods to serve principles that remained constant even as his official allegiances changed with the political winds that swept across territories where law was whatever the strongest man said it was. The silence that followed Mathieu's warning stretched through the Red Moon Saloon like a held breath, because everyone present understood they were witnessing a moment that would either end in immediate bloodshed or become a story told in frontier towns for decades to come. The Crane brothers had built their reputation on terrorizing people who couldn't fight back, but now they faced someone whose reputation was built on killing people exactly like them, bullies who used size and numbers to control others, but had never encountered an opponent who was faster, deadlier, and completely without fear. Bear Crane's hand moved toward his gun with the reflexive arrogance of someone who'd never met real resistance, but something in Mathieu's stillness made him pause before completing the draw. The man in black hadn't moved, hadn't even shifted his weight, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was already 3 moves ahead of anything the Crane brothers might attempt. "You know who we are, stranger?" Bear asked, his voice carrying less certainty than his words suggested. "You know what happens to people who interfere with Crane family business?" The question revealed doubt beneath bluster, because men who were truly confident didn't need to announce their power to their enemies. Lucien Dubois hadn't always been the frightened teenager cowering in the Red Moon Saloon. 6 months ago, he'd been the beloved son of a respected family in French Louisiana, destined for education and comfort until tragedy struck with the swift brutality that frontier life reserved for those who dared to hope for stability. His father, Henri Dubois, had been a successful merchant whose river trade brought prosperity to their small bayou community. But prosperity made enemies among men who preferred theft to honest work. The night that changed everything began with smoke rising from their family warehouse, flames that consumed not just merchandise, but the life Henri had built through decades of honest dealing and fair treatment of customers who'd learned to trust the Dubois name. By dawn, Henri was dead, shot down by claim jumpers who'd decided that stealing was easier than competing, and Lucien's mother had followed her husband into death, her heart unable to survive the loss of everything that had made life worth living. Alone at 17, with nothing but the clothes on his back and his father's last words echoing in his memory. "Son, remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're terrified." Lucien had traveled west seeking the kind of fresh start that frontier territories promised to anyone brave enough to chase dreams across landscapes that killed the weak and rewarded the strong. But the Colorado gold fields had proven as dangerous as the bayou pirates who'd destroyed his family, filled with men who viewed newcomers as prey rather than neighbors. The job that had brought Lucien to Perdition Gulch was hardly the opportunity he'd hoped to find when he'd left Louisiana with dreams of rebuilding what his family had lost. Working as a camp cook for miners who treated him like a servant, earning barely enough to buy food and shelter, watching helplessly as stronger men took whatever they wanted from those too weak to resist. It was a far cry from the respectful treatment he'd known in his father's business, where intelligence and character mattered more than physical strength or willingness to use violence. The worst part wasn't the physical hardship or even the constant fear. It was the crushing loneliness of being surrounded by people who saw him as an easy target, rather than a human being deserving of basic dignity. The drink he'd bought at the Red Moon Saloon was meant to be a small comfort, a momentary escape from the isolation that was eating away at his spirit like acid on metal. Instead, it had attracted the attention of predators who found sport in breaking young men whose only crime was hoping for something better than the cruelty that seemed to define frontier life. The Crane brothers, Jake, Bear, and Silas, had built their empire of fear through systematic brutality that made Perdition Gulch a place where justice existed only for those strong enough to enforce it through violence or wealthy enough to purchase protection from men who'd forgotten the difference between law and lawlessness. They controlled the best mining claims through intimidation, owned the saloon where they held court like medieval lords, and collected tribute from businesses whose owners had learned that paying extortion was cheaper than paying funeral expenses. Jake Crane, the eldest at 32, was the brains of the operation, a man whose intelligence had been corrupted by discovering that fear was more profitable than fairness, and that reputation for ruthlessness was more valuable than any amount of honest work. He'd been educated back east before coming west with dreams of legitimate success, but the lure of easy money through claim jumping and protection rackets had transformed him from ambitious businessman into criminal mastermind whose word was law in a town where legal authority served the highest bidder. Bear Crane was the muscle, a giant whose massive frame and scarred knuckles testified to countless fights where mercy had been abandoned in favor of the kind of decisive brutality that ended disputes permanently. At 28, he'd already killed 6 men in fair fights that had been rigged through intimidation and superior numbers, his reputation for violence serving as enforcer for his brother's schemes. He found genuine pleasure in causing pain, which made him valuable to Jake's organization, but dangerous to anyone unlucky enough to cross their path. Silas, the youngest at 24, was perhaps the most dangerous of the three because his boyish appearance concealed a complete absence of conscience that allowed him to commit atrocities that even hardened criminals found disturbing. He specialized in psychological torture, breaking spirits before breaking bones, and his apparent innocence made him perfect for luring victims into situations where they couldn't escape or call for help. Together, the three brothers had created a reign of terror that had driven decent families from the territory while attracting the kind of human scavengers who thrived in communities where might made right. The confrontation with young Lucian was typical of their methods, identifying the weakest target available, isolating them from potential help, and then taking pleasure in their suffering while demonstrating to witnesses what happened to anyone who dared to challenge Crane authority. They'd tortured dozens of young men whose only crime had been arriving in Perdition Gulch with hope instead of cynicism, dreams instead of weapons, and trust in human decency that had been systematically destroyed through encounters with predators who viewed compassion as weakness to be exploited rather than strength to be respected. Mathieu's response to Bear Crane's threatening question came in the form of movement so fluid and controlled that it seemed choreographed by death itself, his hand settling on his gun grip with casual precision that suggested the weapon was an extension of his will rather than mere tool. "I know exactly who you are," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made smart men listen and stupid ones make fatal mistakes. "You're the Crane brothers who've been terrorizing this territory for 3 years, claim-jumping honest miners and collecting tribute from businesses too scared to resist your protection rackets." The accuracy of Mathieu's assessment sent ripples of unease through the saloon, because most people had suspected what the Crane brothers were doing, but no one had dared to voice such knowledge publicly for fear of becoming their next victims. His direct statement transformed whispered suspicions into open challenge, forcing the brothers to either deny crimes that everyone knew they'd committed or admit to activities that would justify whatever violence was about to follow. "You're making serious accusations, stranger," Jake Crane said, stepping forward with the calculated aggression of someone who'd built his reputation on making examples of people who challenged his authority. The kind of accusations that could get a man killed if he can't back them up with more than just words and reputation. Maybe you should reconsider your involvement in business that doesn't concern you, before you find yourself in deeper water than your swimming skills can handle. But Mathieu's attention had shifted to Lucien, and what he saw in the young man's eyes was heartbreakingly familiar. the look of someone who'd lost everything that made life worth living and was desperately trying to hold on to hope despite circumstances that seemed designed to crush any remaining faith in human decency. It was a look Mathieu recognized from mirrors during his own dark years, when tragedy had nearly destroyed his belief that justice was possible in a world where power flowed to those willing to use violence without restraint. "What's your name, son?" Mathieu asked Lucien, his voice gentle in a way that contrasted sharply with the deadly promise in his posture. When the boy whispered Lucien Dubois, Mathieu heard something in his accent that triggered memories of his own Louisiana childhood, before war and loss had transformed him into the legendary gunfighter who now stood between innocence and corruption. "Well, Lucien Dubois from Louisiana," Mathieu said, never taking his eyes off the three brothers who were calculating their chances against someone whose reputation made even experienced killers nervous. "These gentlemen were just leaving, and they're going to apologize for their rudeness before they go. Aren't you, boys?" The tension in the Red Moon Saloon stretched taut as a bowstring when Bear Crane's pride overcame his survival instincts, his massive hand dropping toward his gun despite every warning signal his brain was sending about the dangers of drawing against someone whose reputation was built on surviving exactly these situations. His movement was fast for a man his size, but it might as well have been underwater compared to Mathieu's response, a draw so quick it seemed to violate the laws of physics as his Colt appeared in his hand and fired before Bear's weapon cleared leather. The bullet took Bear in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun clattering across the saloon floor while he howled in pain and shock at discovering that his reputation for invincibility had just been shattered by someone whose speed defied belief. The shot echoed through the red moon like thunder, followed by silence so complete that the ringing in everyone's ears seemed loud as church bells calling the faithful to worship at the altar of superior marksmanship. "That was your warning shot," Mathieu said calmly, his gun already back in its holster, despite the fact that Bear was still staggering from his wound and Jake and Silas were staring in shock at their brother's blood spreading across his shirt. "The next one goes between someone's eyes, and I don't miss twice. Now, I believe you gentlemen owe this young man an apology for your behavior, and I suggest you make it sincere enough to convince me that you've learned something about manners." Jake Crane's calculation of their situation revealed odds that had shifted dramatically against them, because they were now facing someone who'd just demonstrated capabilities that transformed what should have been an easy intimidation into potential massacre if they chose to escalate further. His brother was wounded. The legendary gunfighter showed no signs of nervousness, despite being outnumbered, and every witness in the saloon was now watching to see whether the Crane brothers' reign of terror could be ended by a single man with faster reflexes and stronger principles. We apologize," Jake said through gritted teeth, the words tasting like poison in his mouth, but necessary to avoid the kind of gunfight that would likely leave all three brothers dead on the saloon floor. "We meant no real harm to the boy. Just frontier fun that got out of hand. No offense intended and none taken, I hope." The apology was grudging and insincere, but it represented the first time in years that the Crane brothers had been forced to back down from confrontation, and Lucien felt something stirring in his chest that had been absent since his parents' death. The possibility that good men still existed in a world that had seemed populated entirely by predators and victims. As the Crane brothers retreated from the saloon with Bear's wound serving as visible reminder of what happened when bullies encountered superior force, Mathieu's attention returned to Lucien with an intensity that made the young man feel simultaneously exposed and protected. There was something in the legendary gunfighter's weathered face that suggested recognition beyond mere sympathy for another victim of frontier brutality. A look that implied shared experience and understanding, born from similar losses that had shaped both their lives in ways that only fellow survivors could fully comprehend. "You're Henri Dubois' boy," Mathieu said, his words hitting Lucien like lightning, because no one in Colorado territory should have known his father's name or recognized family resemblance in features that had been weathered by months of hard labor and poor nutrition. I knew your father during the war, served under him when he was running supplies through Union blockades to keep Confederate civilians from starving. Henri was the most honest man I ever met, and the bravest, though he never carried a gun or claimed to be a fighter. The revelation that this legendary gunfighter had known his father created a connection that transcended the immediate crisis, because Lucien had spent months feeling completely alone in a world where everyone was either enemy or stranger. Learning that someone remembered Henri Dubois as a good man, worth respecting, rather than just another victim of frontier violence, gave weight to memories that had begun to feel like dreams, rather than actual experiences of love and security that had once defined his life. Papa always said the war brought out the best and worst in people, Lucien replied, his voice stronger now that he was talking about something other than his own fear and vulnerability. He never talked much about what he did during those years. But I could see it had marked him, made him determined to build something better than what the fighting had torn down. He believed people could choose to be decent even when circumstances made decency seem impossible. Mathieu's smile was the first genuine warmth Lucien had seen since arriving in Perdition Gulch, because it carried the kind of understanding that came from men who'd witnessed both the nobility and savagery that human beings were capable of when tested by circumstances that revealed character rather than merely reputation. "Your father saved my life more than once," Mathieu said, his words carrying weight that transformed their relationship from stranger helping stranger into something approaching family obligation. Not with bullets or blade work, but by reminding me that honor was worth preserving even when survival seemed to require abandoning everything decent about civilization. I owe Henri Dubois more than I could ever repay, but maybe I can start by making sure his son survives long enough to become the kind of man Henri raised him to be. What began as rescue from immediate danger evolved into something more significant when Mathieu offered to teach Lucien the skills necessary for survival in territories where legal authority was whatever the strongest man said it was, but where those skills had to be balanced with the moral principles that Henri Dubois had instilled in his son during years of demonstrating that strength without conscience was just another form of bullying. The lesson started with basic gunfighting techniques but quickly expanded to include the harder curriculum of knowing when to fight and when to walk away, when to show mercy, and when mercy became cruelty to future victims. "Your father never carried a gun," Mathieu explained as they practiced draw techniques behind the boarding house where Lucien had been staying. But he understood violence better than most professional killers, because he'd seen what happened to communities where good men refused to learn how to protect themselves against bad ones. He believed in peace, but he also understood that peace required people willing to fight for it when talking failed, and running away meant abandoning others to suffer. The physical training was demanding but necessary, because Lucien's slight build and inexperience made him vulnerable to anyone who chose violence over reason. But the mental preparation was more challenging because it required him to accept that survival might demand actions that would have horrified the gentle merchant who'd raised him to believe in human decency. Learning to shoot accurately was relatively simple compared to learning when shooting was justified and when it became murder disguised as self-defense. "The hardest part isn't learning to kill," Mathieu said during one of their evening conversations that served as philosophy lessons disguised as tactical discussions. "It's learning to live with what you've done after the shooting stops, and you're alone with memories of choices that can't be undone." Your father understood that. He carried supplies through war zones not because he enjoyed danger, but because people needed help and he was willing to accept the risks that came with doing right things in wrong circumstances. But the lessons extended beyond gunfighting to include the subtler skills of reading people and situations, understanding when trouble was approaching and how to position oneself to either avoid it or handle it decisively if avoidance proved impossible. Mathieu taught Lucien to observe body language that revealed hostile intentions, to identify escape routes before entering any building, and most importantly, to trust his instincts about people whose friendliness might conceal predatory intentions that would only reveal themselves when their targets were vulnerable and isolated. News of the confrontation at the Red Moon Saloon spread through Perdition Gulch like wildfire, creating the first hope many residents had felt in years that the Crane brothers' reign of terror might finally face serious challenge from someone with both the skills and moral authority to stand against their systematic exploitation of honest families, trying to build decent lives in an unforgiving landscape. The sight of Bear Crane's wounded arm served as visible proof that the brothers weren't invincible, and whispered conversations began to include discussions of resistance that would have been suicidal just days earlier. Dr. Sarah Morell, the territory's only physician and one of the few people who dared to treat Crane victims despite threats against anyone who helped their enemies, was particularly interested in the legendary gunfighter who'd chosen to protect a friendless teenager rather than mind his own business in a town where neutrality was usually the price of survival. Her medical practice had made her witness to countless examples of Crane brutality, and she'd been forced to watch good people suffer while feeling helpless, to provide anything more than bandages for wounds that would heal while leaving scars on souls that might never recover. "Is it true?" she asked Mathieu when he brought Lucien to her clinic for treatment of cuts and bruises from his encounter with the brothers, her voice carrying hope that she'd tried to suppress for 3 years of watching justice fail while violence succeeded. "Are you really planning to stay and help this community, or will you disappear like every other decent man who's passed through Perdition Gulch when he realized what kind of place this has become?" The question revealed how thoroughly the town's residents had been broken by experiences that taught them to expect abandonment rather than protection from people with the power to make a difference. But other reactions were less supportive, particularly from businesses that had learned to profit from the Crane brothers' protection rackets, and from minors whose claims had been acquired through intimidation tactics that might be threatened by the presence of someone willing to investigate rather than ignore criminal activities that had been accepted as normal frontier behavior. "You're going to get a lot of innocent people killed," warned saloon owner Pete Morrison, whose establishment served as Crane headquarters and whose profits depended on maintaining their goodwill. "The brothers have friends throughout the territory, men who won't appreciate outsiders interfering with established arrangements that keep the peace through mutual understanding rather than bloodshed." The division in community opinion revealed how thoroughly fear had corrupted social relationships in a town where survival had required choosing between collaboration with criminals or exodus to regions where starting over was possible, but not guaranteed. Some residents saw Mathieu's intervention as salvation that might restore their community to something resembling civilized society, while others viewed it as dangerous disruption of accommodations that had allowed them to prosper, despite moral compromises that they'd learned to rationalize as necessary evils in territories where absolute good and evil were luxuries that ordinary people couldn't afford. The Crane brothers' response to their public humiliation came 3 nights later in the form of systematic intimidation designed to convince Mathieu and Lucien that continued presence in Perdition Gulch would cost more than any principles were worth, beginning with arson that destroyed the boarding house where Lucien had been staying and escalating to threats against Dr. Morell and other residents who'd shown support for the newcomers who'd dared to challenge established power relationships that had kept the peace through fear rather than justice. The fire started at midnight, flames consuming the building's wooden structure with suspicious speed that suggested accelerants and careful planning rather than accidental ignition from poorly maintained stoves or carelessly discarded cigars. Lucien escaped with nothing but the clothes on his back and the gun Mathieu had given him, watching 3 months of saved wages turn to smoke along with the only possessions that connected him to his parents' memory. photographs and letters that had survived the journey west but couldn't survive the heat of criminal retaliation. "This is just the beginning," Jake Crane announced the next morning when Mathieu confronted him about the arson. His words delivered with the confidence of someone who'd successfully intimidated dozens of previous challengers into leaving town rather than facing escalating violence that would eventually claim innocent lives. "You've got 24 hours to collect your boy and ride out of our territory, or things are going to get a lot worse for people who've shown you hospitality. We've got nothing personal against you, Beaumont, but this is our town and we intend to keep it that way." The threat revealed the brothers' strategy of using community pressure to force unwanted elements to leave voluntarily rather than face the kind of direct confrontation that had already cost Bear his confidence and nearly cost all three their lives. By threatening innocent people who'd helped Mathieu and Lucien, they were forcing the gunfighter to choose between abandoning people who deserved protection or accepting responsibility for violence that would inevitably follow continued resistance to their authority. But Mathieu's response surprised everyone who'd expected either immediate departure or escalating violence that would turn Perdition Gulch into a battleground where innocent people would suffer alongside the combatants whose conflict had triggered community-wide retaliation. "You're right about one thing, Jake," Mathieu said calmly, his words carrying the kind of certainty that made smart men nervous and stupid ones overconfident. "Things are going to get worse, but not for the people you think." As he walked away from the confrontation, leaving Jake Crane wondering what the legendary gunfighter meant by promises that sounded more like prophecy than threat, Mathieu was already planning the kind of response that would teach bullies everywhere that some lines couldn't be crossed without facing consequences that money and reputation couldn't prevent or survive. The arrival of U.S. Marshal David Rousseau in Perdition Gulch came at exactly the right moment to transform a personal conflict between Mathieu and the Crane brothers into official federal investigation of territorial corruption that had been allowing criminal organizations to operate with impunity throughout Colorado's mining regions. Rousseau had been tracking reports of claim jumping, protection rackets, and systematic intimidation that suggested organized criminal activity beyond the capacity of local law enforcement to address through conventional methods that relied on cooperation from officials who might be compromised by the same corruption they were supposed to investigate. "Mathieu Beaumont," Rousseau said, when he found the legendary gunfighter discussing strategy with Dr. Morel and other community leaders who'd decided that federal intervention was their only hope for justice that local authorities couldn't or wouldn't provide. "I've been looking for you since Denver. We've got federal warrants for the Crane brothers based on mail fraud, interstate transportation of stolen goods, and conspiracy to interfere with federal mining regulations. Your reputation suggests you might be exactly the kind of help we need to serve those warrants in a territory where local law enforcement has been compromised by the same criminals we're trying to prosecute." The revelation that federal authorities were finally taking interest in territorial crime that had been dismissed as local problems too small for national attention created hope among residents who'd accepted lawlessness as permanent condition of frontier life. But it also escalated the stakes for everyone involved, because federal intervention meant that the Crane brothers could no longer rely on corrupt local officials to protect them from consequences of criminal activities that had been generating substantial profits through systematic exploitation of honest miners and legitimate businesses. Lucien's role in the federal investigation came through his detailed knowledge of mining camp conditions and his ability to identify victims who might be willing to testify against the Crane organization if they could be guaranteed protection from retaliation that had previously silenced anyone brave enough to speak against criminal activities that everyone knew were occurring, but no one dared to challenge publicly. His youth and obvious honesty made him credible witness whose testimony could support federal charges that required evidence rather than just suspicion to sustain prosecution in territorial courts where procedural requirements protected defendants as well as prosecutors. "This changes everything," Dr. Morell observed as they planned coordination between federal investigation and community protection efforts that would be necessary to keep witnesses alive long enough to testify in proceedings that could finally bring justice to a territory where law had been whatever the strongest criminals said it was. But it also makes us all targets for people who have everything to lose if federal prosecution succeeds in breaking up criminal organizations that have been more profitable than legitimate mining for anyone willing to use violence instead of honest work to acquire wealth that should belong to the people who actually dig it out of the ground. The federal investigation that followed Marshal Rousseau's arrival revealed criminal activities that extended far beyond the Crane brothers' local operations to include territorial-wide conspiracy involving corrupt officials, fraudulent land transactions, and systematic theft of mining claims that had displaced hundreds of honest families while generating enormous profits for criminal organizations that had learned to exploit legal loopholes and judicial corruption to legitimize activities that were essentially organized banditry disguised as business practices. Lucian's contribution to evidence gathering proved invaluable because his work in mining camps had given him access to information that federal investigators couldn't obtain through conventional means, including knowledge of which claims had been stolen through intimidation, which families had been forced to abandon properties they'd legitimately purchased, and which local officials had been taking bribes to facilitate criminal activities that were destroying territorial communities while enriching men who viewed honest work as unnecessary when theft was more profitable and less demanding. The most damaging evidence came from Dr. Morell's medical records, which documented patterns of violence that supported federal charges of conspiracy and interstate criminal activity that fell under federal jurisdiction rather than territorial law enforcement that had been compromised by the same corruption it was supposed to investigate. Her treatment of victims who'd been beaten, shot, and tortured by Crane enforcers provided forensic evidence that connected specific crimes to identifiable perpetrators in ways that could survive legal challenges from defense attorneys who would try to discredit witness testimony through intimidation or character assassination. "We've got enough evidence to hang all three brothers," Rousseau announced after a week of investigation that had uncovered financial records, witness statements, and physical evidence that connected the Crane organization to federal crimes involving mail fraud, transportation of stolen goods across territorial boundaries, and conspiracy to interfere with federal mining regulations that were designed to protect legitimate miners from exactly the kind of predatory behavior that had been destroying Colorado's mining communities. But gathering evidence was easier than protecting witnesses who would need to survive long enough to testify in federal court, because the Crane brothers had been joined by reinforcements from criminal organizations throughout the territory who understood that successful federal prosecution could trigger investigations that would threaten profitable operations in multiple states and territories where organized crime had been operating with impunity through corruption of local officials and intimidation of honest citizens who might otherwise demand law enforcement that served community interests rather than criminal profits. The Crane brothers' response to federal investigation was swift and comprehensive, transforming Perdition Gulch into an armed camp where criminal reinforcements from across the territory prepared to defend their profitable operations against law enforcement that threatened to destroy criminal enterprises that had been generating substantial income through systematic exploitation of honest miners and legitimate businesses. The siege began with strategic positioning of gunmen who controlled access routes that could bring additional federal support while threatening anyone who tried to leave town to seek help from authorities who might be honest enough to serve constitutional law rather than criminal interests. Mathieu's assessment of their tactical situation revealed advantages and disadvantages that would determine whether federal law enforcement could succeed in a community that had been isolated from legitimate authority by geographical barriers and criminal control of communication networks that could summon help or warn potential victims about escalating violence that threatened to consume innocent people, along with the combatants whose conflict had triggered territorial-wide confrontation between organized crime and constitutional government. "We're outnumbered 3-1, Mathieu reported to Rousseau during a strategy meeting that included Dr. Morel, Lucien, and other residents who'd chosen resistance over submission to criminal demands that federal investigation be abandoned in exchange for community safety that would be temporary at best and meaningless at worst. But we've got defensive advantages that could help us hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive, assuming we can get word out about what's happening here without triggering massacre of witnesses whose testimony is essential for successful prosecution." The defensive preparations required ordinary citizens to take up arms in defense of principles they'd never expected to fight for. Because territorial life had taught them to expect abandonment rather than protection from federal authorities, who were usually too distant or too corrupted to provide meaningful help against local problems that seemed small compared to national issues that received attention from politicians and bureaucrats who'd never experienced frontier conditions, where survival often required choosing between collaboration with criminals or exodus to regions where starting over was possible but not guaranteed. Lucien's transformation from frightened teenager to competent defender of his community was accelerated by circumstances that demanded courage rather than training, wisdom rather than experience, and commitment to principles that were more important than personal safety, when the alternative was submission to criminal authority that viewed human beings as resources to be exploited rather than citizens deserving protection under constitutional law, that meant something only when people were willing to fight for it regardless of personal cost or likelihood of success. The first major assault came at dawn, with criminal forces attempting to overwhelm defensive positions through coordinated attacks that revealed military-style planning and equipment that suggested connections to criminal organizations that extended far beyond territorial boundaries to include interstate conspiracy involving corrupt officials, fraudulent business practices, and systematic exploitation of natural resources that belonged to communities rather than criminal enterprises that had learned to steal wealth through violence and legal manipulation. Mathieu's leadership during the battle showcased skills that had made him legendary throughout the American West, coordinating defensive fire with tactical precision that maximized their limited ammunition while minimizing casualties among residents who'd volunteered to defend principles they believed were worth dying for, even when survival seemed impossible against odds that favored attackers who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from eliminating witnesses whose testimony could destroy profitable criminal operations. The most critical moment came when criminal forces breached the main defensive line and threatened to overrun positions where Dr. Morel was treating wounded defenders, while Lucien coordinated ammunition distribution among residents whose determination was stronger than their military training, but whose courage was being tested by violence that exceeded anything they'd experienced during previous confrontations with local bullies who'd seemed dangerous until they encountered organized criminal armies with professional equipment and tactical expertise. "Hold the line!" Mathieu shouted as he moved between defensive positions, his guns blazing at targets that seemed to multiply despite casualties that should have discouraged continued assault, by rational men who understood that victory was becoming more expensive than any potential profits could justify. But these weren't rational men. They were criminals who understood that federal prosecution meant death sentences for activities that had been generating enormous wealth through systematic exploitation of territorial communities that lacked protection from constitutional authorities who were supposed to serve citizens rather than criminal interests. The battle's outcome remained uncertain until Lucien's marksmanship, improved through weeks of training under Mathieu's guidance, eliminated 3 key attackers whose deaths broke the assault's momentum and forced surviving criminals to reconsider whether continued fighting was worth the cost in lives lost for objectives that were becoming increasingly unlikely to succeed against defenders who were fighting for home and family, rather than just money and criminal enterprises that could be rebuilt elsewhere if necessary. The tide of battle shifted dramatically when a group of honest miners arrived from surrounding camps. Their arrival timed perfectly to catch criminal forces between defending townspeople and fresh fighters who'd decided that federal investigation was their only hope for justice, that territorial authorities couldn't or wouldn't provide through legal channels that had been corrupted by the same criminal organizations they were supposed to prosecute under constitutional law that meant nothing without enforcement by people willing to risk everything for principles that were more important than personal safety. "We heard gunfire from 15 miles away," announced Tom Bergeron, a French-Canadian prospector whose camp had been raided twice by Crane enforcers seeking to steal claims that represented years of honest work and legitimate investment in equipment and infrastructure that criminal organizations viewed as free resources to be appropriated through violence and intimidation that was cheaper than actual mining operations that required capital, expertise, and willingness to work for profits rather than steal them from people who couldn't defend themselves against organized criminal activity. The reinforcements brought not just additional firepower, but also evidence of criminal activities that connected the Crane organization to interstate conspiracy involving multiple states and territories where similar operations had been exploiting honest miners and legitimate businesses through systematic intimidation, fraudulent legal proceedings, and corruption of local officials who were supposed to protect citizens rather than facilitate criminal enterprises that viewed law enforcement as business partners rather than obstacles to profitable exploitation of natural resources and human communities. Lucien's role in coordinating the Allied defense revealed leadership qualities that had been developing through weeks of training under Mathieu's guidance and testing under circumstances that demanded courage rather than experience, wisdom rather than formal education, and commitment to principles that were being proven through actions rather than just words. His knowledge of local geography and criminal tactics made him valuable liaison between established defenders and newly arrived allies who needed tactical information to maximize their effectiveness against enemies who knew the terrain and had prepared defensive positions. "This is what your father would have wanted," Mathieu told Lucien during a brief lull in fighting that allowed tactical assessment of their improved situation. "Not the violence, but the community coming together to protect something worth defending." Henri always said that courage was contagious, that one person willing to do right could inspire others to remember that they had choices about what kind of world they wanted to live in. The observation reminded Lucien that their fight was about more than immediate survival. It was about creating the kind of community where decent people could build honest lives without fearing criminal predators who viewed civilization as hunting ground rather than home. Jake Crane's decision to end the siege through personal combat rather than continued military assault came from recognition that his criminal organization was losing more than it could afford while gaining nothing except additional enemies and federal attention that would make profitable operations impossible throughout territories where law enforcement was finally taking interest in activities that had been generating substantial wealth through systematic exploitation of honest communities that deserved constitutional protection rather than criminal predation. The challenge was delivered formally, with Jake proposing single combat between himself and Mathieu to determine the outcome of federal investigation that had already gathered sufficient evidence to destroy the Crane organization, but might be abandoned if their primary enforcer could eliminate the legendary gunfighter whose reputation had inspired community resistance that was threatening to spread throughout territories where criminal organizations had previously operated with impunity through corruption of local officials and intimidation of honest citizens. "Winner takes all," Jake announced from behind white flag that protected him during negotiations that revealed his desperation to find some resolution short of total destruction of criminal enterprises that had been more profitable than legitimate business for people willing to use violence instead of honest work to acquire wealth that should belong to the communities who actually produced it through mining, farming, and other productive activities that created value rather than just stealing it from others. Mathieu's acceptance of the challenge was immediate and absolute, because he understood that Jake's proposal represented the best opportunity to end violence without additional casualties among innocent people who'd already sacrificed more than should be necessary to obtain justice that was supposed to be guaranteed by constitutional law, but had to be fought for against criminal organizations that viewed legal authority as commodity to be purchased rather than principle to be respected. The formal duel that followed was witnessed by both sides as binding arbitration that would determine whether criminal organizations could continue exploiting territorial communities through violence and corruption, or whether federal law enforcement would finally provide constitutional protection for honest citizens who deserved better than systematic predation by organized criminals who viewed human beings as resources to be exploited rather than neighbors deserving respect and protection under law that meant something only when people were willing to enforce it through whatever means proved necessary. The gunfight that would determine the fate of Perdition Gulch, and by extension the future of law enforcement throughout Colorado territory, took place in the town's main street at precisely noon, with Jake Crane and Mathieu Beaumont facing each other across 50 yards of dusty ground, while representatives of criminal organizations and federal law enforcement watched from positions that would allow them to honor whatever outcome the combat produced through superior skill, courage, and commitment to principles that were more important than personal survival. Jake's confidence in his abilities was justified by years of successful intimidation and several kills against opponents who'd been foolish enough to challenge Crane authority through violence rather than submission. But his experience had been against miners and merchants rather than professional gunfighters whose skills had been tested in situations where defeat meant death and victory required capabilities that exceeded anything necessary for terrorizing honest citizens who'd never learned to fight against organized criminal activity that exploited their decency and trust in human nature. The draw itself was poetry written in gunpowder and death, with both men moving simultaneously, but Mathieu's legendary speed proving superior in ways that transformed what should have been mutual destruction into decisive victory for principles over profit, justice over criminal exploitation, and constitutional law over organized predation that had been treating territorial communities as hunting grounds rather than homes where decent people deserved protection under federal authority that meant something only when enforced by people willing to risk everything for others. Jake Crane's death was instantaneous and final, his body hitting the dusty street before his gun had cleared leather, while Mathieu stood untouched except for powder burns that testified to how close the contest had been between two men whose different commitments to opposing principles had made compromise impossible and violence inevitable, despite preferences for resolution that didn't require bloodshed to determine which vision of territorial society would prevail in communities that deserved better than criminal exploitation disguised as legitimate business practices. The silence that followed the gunshot stretched across Perdition Gulch like Judgment Day, because everyone present understood that they'd witnessed more than personal combat between individual enemies. They'd seen constitutional authority triumph over criminal organization in ways that would reshape power relationships throughout territories, where federal law enforcement was finally taking interest in protecting honest citizens from predatory exploitation that had been generating enormous profits for criminal enterprises that viewed human communities as resources to be consumed rather than defended. The systematic arrest of Crane organization members that followed Jake's death in formal combat proceeded with military efficiency that reflected months of federal investigation and preparation for exactly this kind of comprehensive law enforcement action designed to destroy criminal enterprises rather than just capturing individual criminals who could be replaced by others willing to continue profitable exploitation of territorial communities that had been abandoned to predatory organizations by distant authorities who'd finally recognized their constitutional obligations. Bear and Silas Crane surrendered without resistance once they realized that their brother's death had ended any hope of successful opposition to federal prosecution that would likely result in death sentences for activities that had been generating substantial wealth through systematic intimidation, fraudulent legal proceedings, and corruption of territorial officials who'd been serving criminal interests rather than constitutional law that was supposed to protect honest citizens from exactly the kind of predatory behavior that had made legitimate business impossible. The evidence gathered during federal investigation revealed criminal networks that extended far beyond the Crane brothers' local operations to include interstate conspiracy involving corrupt officials in multiple territories, fraudulent mining companies that existed only to steal legitimate claims, and transportation networks that moved stolen goods across state boundaries in violation of federal laws that carried mandatory death penalties for activities that had been treated as local problems too small for national attention until honest citizens demanded protection that territorial authorities couldn't or wouldn't provide. Lucian's testimony before a federal grand jury provided crucial evidence that connected specific crimes to identifiable perpetrators in ways that would survive legal challenges from defense attorneys who specialized in protecting criminal organizations through technical objections and procedural delays that had previously allowed guilty defendants to escape justice through corruption of legal proceedings that were supposed to serve constitutional principles, rather than criminal profits generated through systematic exploitation of honest communities. Dr. Morell's medical records provided forensic evidence that supported federal charges of conspiracy, interstate transportation of stolen goods, and systematic intimidation of witnesses whose testimony was essential for successful prosecution of criminal organizations that had been operating with impunity through corruption of local officials and geographic isolation that had made federal intervention seem impossible until honest citizens demanded constitutional protection that was their right under law, that meant something only when enforced by people willing to risk everything for others. The federal court proceedings that followed the destruction of the Crane organization established legal precedents that would protect territorial communities from criminal exploitation for generations to come, creating constitutional framework for law enforcement that served citizens rather than corrupt officials who'd been treating public office as opportunity for personal enrichment through collaboration with organized criminals who viewed government authority as commodity to be purchased rather than principle to be respected through honest service to democratic ideals. Mathieu's appointment as territorial marshal provided ongoing law enforcement that could prevent future criminal organizations from establishing the kind of systematic exploitation that had made legitimate business impossible in regions where constitutional authority had been abandoned to predatory enterprises that treated human communities as hunting grounds rather than homes deserving protection under federal law that was supposed to guarantee certain rights, regardless of geographical location or local political conditions. Lucian's transformation from frightened teenager to respected community leader represented hope for future generations who would grow up in territories where constitutional law meant something because ordinary citizens had been willing to fight for principles that were more important than personal safety when the alternative was submission to criminal authority that viewed human beings as resources to be exploited rather than neighbors deserving respect and protection under democratic government that served people rather than profit. The mining operations that resumed under honest management generated prosperity that benefited entire communities rather than just criminal organizations, creating economic foundation for territorial development that respected both human rights and environmental responsibility, while providing opportunities for legitimate investment that rewarded productive work, rather than predatory exploitation of natural resources that belong to communities, rather than corporations willing to steal whatever wasn't legally protected by authorities who understood their constitutional obligations. Dr. Morell's expansion of medical services to include surrounding communities provided health care that had been impossible during criminal control of territorial resources, creating infrastructure for civilized society that supported families and businesses, while ensuring that future conflicts could be resolved through legal proceedings rather than violence that had been necessary only because constitutional authority had been abandoned to criminal organizations that viewed law enforcement as business partners rather than obstacles to profitable exploitation of honest citizens who deserved better treatment under democratic government that was supposed to serve everyone rather than just wealthy interests. 5 years later, Perdition Gulch had been transformed into Beaumont Falls, a thriving community named in honor of the legendary gunfighter who'd taught 3 generations that courage was indeed contagious and that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they were willing to stand up for principles that were more important than personal safety or social approval from neighbors who'd learned to choose collaboration over resistance when faced with seemingly impossible odds against organized criminal activity. Lucien Dubois, now 22 and serving as the community's elected sheriff, had grown into the kind of man his father Henri would have been proud to call son, someone who understood that strength without conscience was just another form of bullying, but who also knew that good intentions without courage to enforce them were meaningless when confronted by predators who viewed human decency as weakness to be exploited rather than strength to be respected through democratic participation in government that served citizens rather than criminal interests. The school that had been established in the town's center taught children not just reading and arithmetic, but also the constitutional principles that had been proven through blood and sacrifice when honest citizens had chosen resistance over submission to criminal authority that treated law enforcement as commodity to be purchased rather than service to be provided through democratic institutions that were supposed to protect everyone rather than just wealthy interests with political connections. Mathieu's reputation had grown beyond his actual achievements to become symbol of hope for anyone facing impossible odds in fights against powerful enemies who seemed untouchable through conventional means. But the reality of his continued work as territorial marshal was creating practical results that protected communities from exploitation more effectively than any amount of violent legend could have achieved through fear, rather than respect for constitutional law that meant something when enforced by people who understood their obligations to serve others. The Red Moon Saloon had been transformed into a community meeting hall where citizens gathered to discuss local affairs and plan improvements that would benefit everyone rather than just wealthy interests. But a plaque near the former bar commemorated the night when a legendary gunfighter had taught 3 bullies that some actions carried consequences that could not be avoided through intimidation or influence, and every year on the anniversary of that confrontation, people gathered to remember that justice was possible when ordinary individuals found extraordinary courage to stand up for principles that were more important than personal safety. The frightened teenager had become a respected leader, the legendary gunslinger had spoken through action rather than words, and the legacy that emerged from their encounter continued to inspire anyone who believed that right was stronger than might when supported by people willing to risk everything for the protection of those who could not protect themselves.